Iran has strongly rejected the United Nations decision to reimpose sanctions on its nuclear program, calling the move illegal and politically motivated. For the first time in a decade, the UN has reinstated sweeping restrictions on Tehran, a step that has ignited diplomatic tensions and worsened the already fragile Iranian economy. The Iranian government responded by recalling its ambassadors from Britain, France and Germany, signalling a sharp escalation in its dispute with the West. The sanctions package includes an arms embargo, a ban on uranium enrichment, restrictions on missile technology transfers, a freeze on overseas assets, and travel bans on key officials. For ordinary Iranians, the consequences are immediate and painful. Streets in Tehran may still look busy, but beneath the surface, daily life is becoming harder. One resident lamented the sudden rise in prices. "I was buying things for my home, and in just 3 days, everything suddenly got 10 million tomans more expensive, even though the dollar hasn't gone up much yet." Another citizen warned prices are already crushing people. And now imports will become harder, exports practically non-existent. Ordinary people really might not be able to live the way they do now. The financial strain is reflected in Iran's plunging currency. The rial fell to a record low of 1.1 million to the US dollar, driving food prices even higher and worsening the cost of living crisis. The sanctions snapback comes a decade after the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, the landmark deal that saw Iran limit its nuclear activities in exchange for economic relief. The United States later withdrew from the deal in 2018, a move that fueled renewed distrust and set the stage for today's crisis. The foreign ministers of Germany, France and the UK, the so-called E3, said they were left with no alternative. They accused Iran of failing to meet its commitments under the nuclear accord, triggering the snapback clause to restore UN restrictions. E3 leaders hope that sanctions will pressure Tehran back to the negotiating table. Iran, however, has rejected the move outright. An Iranian Foreign Ministry statement insisted Iran considers the restoration of the UN sanctions to be illegal. Iran does not consider itself legally bound to recognize those illegal resolutions, including the suspension of uranium enrichment. The human toll of sanctions is evident in Tehran's streets. Many citizens blame both external pressure and domestic leadership for the crisis. One resident expressed frustration with the country's nuclear ambitions. "I would have suspended the nuclear program at least 5 years ago and would care about the people. We could have done a lot of things to get rid of these difficulties." Others worry that Iran's growing isolation will mirror North Korea's experience. If we continue to get into a fight with the outside world and become isolated like North Korea, good things won't happen at all. We're already seeing the impact of this. The dollar rate is going up. To understand the implications, Cameron Martin, a senior lecturer in international relations at the University of Sussex, explained that sanctions are not new to Iran. The sanctions have been on Iran for quite a long time, on and off since the discovery of Iran's nuclear program back in 2003. Martin noted that the burden of sanctions often falls disproportionately on ordinary citizens, while powerful state institutions, especially the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, have sometimes benefited by creating a shadow economy. He added, prior to these sanctions, the United States' unilateral sanctions following the withdrawal from the nuclear deal in 2015, especially secondary sanctions that punished any country trading with Iran, had already caused a massive impact on the Iranian economy and the welfare of the ordinary people. With the UN sanctions back, many more countries are bound legally to observe those sanctions, and this is likely to worsen the economic situation. Martin also highlighted growing domestic resentment toward the nuclear program. Many Iranians believe that the nuclear program, which produces close to zero energy or has any significant impact on Iranians' livelihoods, is a burden that has caused all these sanctions and confrontation with the West, including the war with Israel. The nuclear program is increasingly an unpopular project, which is causing all this damage to Iranians, and people want to have a say on its continuation. Martin outlined the internal political struggle in Tehran. There are two camps within the establishment, as always has been the case within the Iranian political system. The so-called hardliners believe that Iran has to leave the NPT and go towards formal weaponization of its nuclear program, even testing a nuclear weapon as a guarantee against future attacks by either Israel or the United States. On the other hand, there are others within the establishment, the reformist camp, who believe in concessions and talks with the West in the hope of reaching a deal with a future US administration. He stressed that the hardliners currently hold the upper hand due to the supreme leader's opposition to talks with Washington. Despite Tehran's repeated assurances that it does not seek a nuclear weapon, skepticism remains. Martin observed, "I find it difficult to believe, and many Iranians also do so, because Iran has had enrichment of 20%, 60%, on occasions even 80%, and those levels of enrichment are not consistent with a civilian program." He added that this ambiguity undermines Iran's stance and gives its adversaries, particularly Israel, justification for pressure and potential military action. The Iranian leadership has warned of a harsh response to the renewed sanctions. Ali Fatah Nad, director of the think tank Center for Middle East and Global Order, outlined potential scenarios. For instance, the Iranian parliament will be openly debating whether Iran is going to withdraw from the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. This carries a lot of risks because it could invite military action by Israel and/or the United States. Other possibilities include acts of destabilization in international waters in the Persian Gulf, or even hostage-taking. But all of those possibilities are risky and will impose costs on Iran. Fatah Nad emphasized that Tehran's options for retaliation are limited and fraught with danger. Despite heightened tensions, the United States and Europe have signaled willingness to keep channels of dialogue open. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio has called for Iran to engage in direct talks, a position echoed by European allies. Fatah Nad acknowledged this opening but warned of persistent obstacles. The continuation of diplomacy is in the cards, but whether diplomacy is going to be successful is a very tricky question because it would require Iranian concessions, which the Iranian side has not been willing to give, for instance, on agreeing to zero enrichment. The effectiveness of sanctions, Fatah Nad said, will largely depend on how major players like China respond. We will have to see, for instance, how China is going to deal with it. China is the main buyer of Iranian oil. There is also the possibility that China will continue buying Iranian oil, but even at a steeper discount. But the reimposition of UN sanctions will certainly aggravate the economic crisis and isolation of Iran, because international actors are now bound not only by unilateral US sanctions, but also by UN binding sanctions. He warned that this will deepen Iran's inflation, weaken its currency, and make life harder for ordinary citizens. Diplomatic efforts have repeatedly faltered this year. The US insists on zero enrichment and on curbing Iran's missile range to 500 kilometers, conditions Tehran refuses to accept. US demands are somehow contradicting the business model of the Islamic Republic, Fatah Nad explained. This impasse underscores the deep divide between Tehran and Western powers over the scope and purpose of Iran's nuclear activities. As the sanctions bite deeper and the economy reels, Iran faces mounting pressure from both within and outside its borders. Hardliners see defiance as a path to security, while reformists warn that isolation will only worsen hardship. Ordinary Iranians, meanwhile, bear the brunt of the crisis, struggling with rising prices, shrinking opportunities, and a future clouded by uncertainty. The UN sanctions return has reignited debates over Iran's nuclear ambitions, the effectiveness of international pressure, and the prospects for renewed diplomacy. Whether Tehran chooses confrontation or compromise may determine not only the fate of the nuclear program, but also the country's place in the global order.